They sold an obese black woman as a useless virgin in front of a laughing crowd. But what the Hell's Angel did next left everyone speechless. A broken woman, shamed for her body and her faith, stands on that stage wishing she could disappear. Until a stranger steps forward, a man everyone calls Hell's Angel, and says just 5 words that change everything. I'll buy her myself. But this isn't a love story you've heard before. Because what starts as an act of mercy turns into a storm of scandal, faith, and redemption. As the world mocks them, and the woman no one wanted becomes the soul who saves them all. When compassion defies cruelty, when a single act of grace ignites a miracle, how far will they go to prove that every life has worth? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The warm glow of the church hall lights did little to comfort Clarissa Jones as she stood in the corner, her fingers trembling against the ceramic dish of freshly baked cornbread. The familiar sense of butter and honey that usually brought her peace now turned sour in her stomach as laughter and whispers echoed through the room. She'd spent hours in her kitchen preparing the cornbread, hoping it might make a difference at the charity auction. The recipe was her mama's, passed down through generations, and usually brought smiles to people's faces. But tonight, those smiles had turned cruel. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet as she shifted her weight, trying to make herself smaller, an impossible task for her large frame. Her floral dress, chosen with care for the evening, now felt like a spotlight drawing unwanted attention. "Hey!" A man's voice, thick with alcohol, cut through the general chatter. "Y'all know what would really bring in some money?" He stumbled forward, red-faced and grinning. "We got ourselves a special item right here." Clarissa's heart began to race. She knew that tone. She'd heard it before, in school hallways and grocery store aisles. The sound of someone about to turn her into a joke. "Look at her," another man joined in, his words slurring. 42 years old and ain't never been married. Bet she's still pure as the driven snow." The laughter grew louder, spreading through the crowd like a virus. Mrs. Peterson, who sat in the pew in front of Clarissa every Sunday, covered her mouth to hide her giggle. Mr. Thompson, who always praised her baking, now wouldn't meet her eyes. "Who'll buy the useless virgin?" the first man called out, turning it into a twisted auction. "Come on, folks! Special deal tonight only!" The cornbread dish shook in Clarissa's hands. She wanted to run, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The lights seemed too bright, the room too small, the air too thick to breathe. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring the faces of people she'd known her whole life, people who were supposed to be her church family. "I mean, what good is she?" someone else chimed in. "Can't even find herself a man with all that cooking." The tears spilled over now, rolling down her cheeks. The cornbread, still warm from her oven, felt like a lead weight in her hands. All her efforts to belong, to contribute, to be worthy, reduced to cruel entertainment for a drunken crowd. $1, someone shouted mockingly. 50 cents, a quarter for the whole package. Each bid felt like a physical blow. Clarissa's vision tunneled, the edges of the room growing dark. The cross hanging on the wall behind the pulpit seemed to mock her now, its promise of love and acceptance feeling hollow in this moment of public humiliation. Then, cutting through the cacophony of cruel laughter and jeers, a deep voice spoke. "I'll buy her." The room fell silent so suddenly, it was as if someone had thrown a switch. The sound of heavy boots on hardwood floor echoed through the hall as Eli Matthews stepped forward from the shadows near the door. Clarissa had heard about him. Everyone had. The ex-firefighter they called Hell's Angel, with his scarred arms and quiet ways. He rarely came to town events, preferring the solitude of his ranch outside town. Yet here he was, his weathered leather jacket creaking as he moved through the parting crowd. His face was set in lines of quiet determination as he approached the front of the room. Without a word, he pulled out his wallet and placed a crisp $100 bill on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood seemed to echo in the stunned silence. "Sold," he said quietly, his voice carrying authority that needed no volume to command attention. He turned to Clarissa, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected, not pity, but understanding, respect. He held out his hand to her, calloused and strong. "Ma'am?" For a moment, Clarissa couldn't move. The cornbread dish trembled in her hands as she looked at his offered hand, then at the shocked faces of the crowd. Mrs. Peterson had stopped giggling. Mr. Thompson finally met her gaze, shame coloring his features. With a gentle movement that seemed to deny the roughness of his appearance, Eli took the cornbread dish from her hands and set it on a nearby table. Then he offered his hand again, patient and steady. This time Clarissa took it. His palm was warm against hers, anchoring her in the moment as the room spun with whispers and confused murmurs. He didn't rush her, didn't pull or push. He simply stood beside her, a solid presence that seemed to shield her from the stares and whispers. Together they walked toward the door. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea, faces showing a mix of shock, shame, and curiosity. The cool evening air hit Clarissa's tear-stained face as they stepped outside, carrying with it the scent of magnolia blossoms and approaching rain. Behind them, the stunned silence of the church hall spoke volumes. The sounds of their footsteps on the gravel parking lot seemed to echo in the quiet night, punctuated only by the distant sound of crickets and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. The cruelty of the evening hung in the air between them, but Eli's hand remained steady in hers, offering support without demand, dignity without condition. In that moment, as they walked away from the laughter that had turned to shocked silence, Clarissa felt something she hadn't expected. Not just rescue from humiliation, but the first stirring of something that felt remarkably like hope. The old pickup truck's engine rumbled softly as they drove through the darkening streets. Clarissa sat rigid in the passenger seat, her purse clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. The leather seat creaked beneath her as she tried to make herself smaller, a habit born from years of trying to take up less space in a world that seemed to have no room for her. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the engine's hum, "please protect me, please guide me, please help me understand." Her fingers worked nervously at the worn strap of her purse, trembling slightly. The streetlights cast intermittent shadows across Eli's face as he drove, his expression calm and focused on the road ahead. The burn scars on his forearms caught the light when he adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, telling silent stories of pain and sacrifice. Finally, gathering her courage, Clarissa spoke. Her voice quavered but carried a dignity that even the night's humiliation couldn't completely strip away. "Sir, Mr. Matthews, what do you plan to do with me?" Eli glanced over at her, his eyes kind but serious in the dashboard light. "Miss Jones, I don't own people. Never have, never will." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What I bought back there was your dignity. Those folks had no right to treat you that way." The truck turned onto a gravel road, tires crunching rhythmically beneath them. "I run a place called Grace Haven Ranch," he continued. "It's a rehabilitation community. We work with veterans trying to find their way back to civilian life, single mothers who need a fresh start, folks recovering from addiction, anyone who needs a quiet place to heal. They passed through an iron gate with Grace Haven Ranch worked into the metalwork, the letters gleaming faintly in the truck's headlights. As they drove deeper into the property, Clarissa pressed her face closer to the window, taking in what she could see in the gathering dusk. Carefully maintained gardens stretched out on either side of the gravel drive. Simple wooden cabins, their windows glowing with warm light, dotted the landscape. In the distance, a lake reflected the last remnants of sunset, its surface smooth as glass and surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. "It's beautiful," Clarissa whispered, almost to herself. As Eli parked the truck near what appeared to be the main building, several people emerged from various cabins, curious about the late-night arrival. Clarissa noticed their expressions, some welcoming, others clearly suspicious or disapproving. She felt her chest tighten with familiar anxiety. Eli stepped out of the truck and came around to open her door, offering his hand just as he had at the church. "Come on," he said gently. "Let me introduce you to everyone." Standing in the warm glow of the porch lights, Eli addressed the small gathering. "Everyone, this is Miss Clarissa Jones. She'll be joining us as our newest volunteer." His tone carried an authority that discouraged questions, though Clarissa could see them burning in the onlookers' eyes. A woman with graying hair stepped forward, her smile genuine if cautious. "Welcome to Grace Haven, Miss Jones. I'm Martha. I help coordinate the kitchen duties." Others introduced themselves, a young veteran named James who walked with a slight limp, a teenage boy who barely met her eyes, a middle-aged woman holding a sleeping toddler. Each introduction felt like a small weight lifting from Clarissa's shoulders, though she could still feel the stares of those who hung back in the shadows. "Let's get you settled in," Eli said after the introductions were complete. He led her to a small cabin set slightly apart from the others, carrying the single bag she'd had with her at the church. The cabin was simple but welcoming. A queen-sized bed dominated the main room, covered with a handmade floral quilt in soft blues and creams. A wooden rocking chair sat by the window, and a small desk occupied one corner. The walls were bare except for a simple cross above the bed and a framed photograph of the lake at sunrise. On the bedside table, a well-worn Bible rested on a crocheted doily, its pages marked with colored ribbons. Next to it stood a small lamp that cast a warm, golden glow throughout the room. "Bathroom's through that door," Eli said, setting her bag down. "Kitchen's stocked with basics. Martha will show you around properly tomorrow." He paused at the door. "Get some rest, Miss Jones. You're safe here." After he left, Clarissa sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the soft quilt. The events of the evening crashed over her like a wave. The cruel laughter, the mocking bids, the shame that had burned through her very being. But also the unexpected rescue, the quiet strength of this scarred man who had stepped forward when no one else would. Her tears came then, hot and heavy, soaking into the quilt as she curled up on her side. "Why, Lord," she whispered between sobs, "why would this stranger care? Why would he help someone like me?" The ceiling fan turned slowly above her, its gentle whirring accompanying her prayers. Through the window she could see the moon reflecting off the lake, its light catching the ripples made by a gentle breeze. The peace of the place seemed to seep into the room, even as her tears continued to fall. She cried until her eyes burned and her throat felt raw, all the years of loneliness and rejection pouring out in the safety of this small cabin. The Bible on the nightstand caught her eye, its familiar presence both a comfort and a question. She reached out and touched its worn cover, feeling the smoothness that came from years of handling. As exhaustion finally began to overtake her, Clarissa's prayers became simpler, more direct. "Please, Lord," she whispered into the quiet room, "help me understand. Help me find my way. Help me see why you brought me here." The sound of crickets filtered through the windows, a gentle chorus accompanying her toward sleep. Far off, an owl called, its lonely sound echoing across the lake. Clarissa's eyes grew heavy, her breath gradually steadying as she drifted off, still fully dressed atop the floral quilt, one hand resting on the Bible beside her. The night settled around the cabin like a gentle blanket, while inside, Clarissa Jones, the woman who had started her evening as the subject of cruel mockery, finally found rest in this unexpected sanctuary, her tears gradually giving way to the deep breathing of exhausted sleep. Golden sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Clarissa's cabin, painting delicate patterns across her face. The distant crow of roosters pierced the morning calm, and a warm, yeasty aroma of fresh-baked bread drifted through her window. For a moment, she lay disoriented, her heart racing as she tried to remember where she was. The events of the previous night came rushing back, the humiliation at the church hall, Eli's unexpected intervention, and her arrival at Grace Haven Ranch. Clarissa sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping in her clothes on top of the quilt. Her eyes felt puffy from crying, and her throat was still raw. A gentle knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Jones?" Eli's deep voice carried through the wood. "Breakfast is ready whenever you are." Just a minute," she called back, her voice trembling slightly. She hurried to smooth her rumpled clothes and pat down her hair, grateful she'd packed a small toiletry bag in her purse. When she emerged from the cabin 10 minutes later, the morning air was crisp and sweet. Dew sparkled on the grass, and birds called from the surrounding pine trees. The lake she'd glimpsed last night stretched out like polished silver in the distance. Eli waited patiently on the porch, his scarred hands wrapped around a steaming coffee mug. "Sleep okay?" he asked, his eyes kind but not pitying. "Yes, thank you," Clarissa answered softly, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. He led her to the main building, a rustic structure with a wide wraparound porch. Inside, the smell of bread was even stronger, mingling with bacon and coffee. Several residents sat at long wooden tables, some talking quietly, others eating in silence. "Miss Thelma," Eli called to an elderly woman working in the kitchen. "Could you show Miss Jones around? Today? Get her started with some tasks?" The woman turned, revealing a face lined with age but brightened by sharp, intelligent eyes. "Course I can," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Come on, sugar, let's get you fed first." As Clarissa followed Miss Thelma to the serving counter, she heard snickering from one of the tables. A young man with close-cropped hair and bitter eyes watched her, whispering something to his companion that made them both laugh. Clarissa's cheeks burned as she recognized the familiar mockery in their expressions. "Don't you mind Mason?" Miss Thelma said quietly, loading Clarissa's plate with eggs and fresh bread. "That boy's got more demons than sense right now." Throughout the morning, Miss Thelma kept Clarissa busy with simple tasks. They started in the laundry room, folding sheets and towels into neat stacks. The repetitive motion was soothing, and Miss Thelma's steady stream of conversation helped ease Clarissa's nerves. "Been here 3 years myself," the older woman explained, expertly folding a fitted sheet. "After my Harold passed, didn't know what to do with myself. Eli offered me a place here, said they needed someone with nursing experience." She glanced at Clarissa. "Everyone's got their story here, sugar. All different kinds of hurt." Later, they moved to the kitchen, where Clarissa helped prepare lunch for the residents. Her hands knew their way around a kitchen, and for the first time since arriving, she felt somewhat competent. That feeling didn't last long. Mason appeared in the doorway, his face twisted in a smirk. "Hey, new girl," he called out. Better save some of that food for the rest of us." His friends laughed, and Clarissa's hands began to shake. "Mason Riley!" Miss Thelma's voice cracked like a whip. "You want to explain to Eli why you're not at your assigned duties?" The young veteran's face darkened, but he retreated, leaving Clarissa fighting back tears. After lunch, Miss Thelma sent her to feed the chickens, saying the fresh air would do her good. Clarissa found the task peaceful at first, watching the hens scratch and peck at the feed she scattered. But the shame and hurt from the morning's encounters began to well up inside her. "What am I doing here?" she whispered to herself. "These people have real problems, war wounds, addiction, loss, and I'm just... The tears came then, hot and heavy. She hurried behind the barn, pressing her face against the rough wood, trying to muffle her sobs. "Pain is pain," a quiet voice said behind her. "Doesn't matter what shape it takes." Clarissa whirled to find Eli standing there, his expression gentle but firm. "I don't belong here," she choked out. I haven't." "You think emotional wounds hurt less than physical ones?" He held up his scarred arms. "These healed years ago. But the ones you can't see? Those take longer. Sometimes a lifetime." His words penetrated the wall of shame she'd built around herself. Touching, something deep and raw. She nodded, unable to speak. "Take your time," he said softly. "Grace Haven isn't just a place to heal. It's a place to learn who you really are, who God made you to be." As evening approached, Miss Thelma found Clarissa sitting quietly by the lake. "Come on, sugar," she said. "Time to make cornbread for dinner." Clarissa tensed. "I don't think..." "Nonsense. Best cornbread maker in 3 counties from what I hear, and I need the help." In the warm kitchen, Miss Thelma pulled out ingredients while sharing stories about her nursing days. Her matter-of-fact manner and gentle humor gradually put Clarissa at ease. Soon, they were working side by side, the familiar motions of mixing and measuring bringing comfort. "Now, that's what I call cornbread," Miss Thelma declared, when Clarissa pulled the golden brown pans from the oven. The older woman broke off a piece and took a bite, closing her eyes in appreciation. "Lord have mercy, child. You've got a gift." Something in the simple praise, so different from the previous night's mockery, broke through Clarissa's defenses. A small laugh escaped her lips, tentative at first, then growing stronger as Miss Thelma joined in. The sound of their shared laughter filled the kitchen, mixing with the scent of fresh cornbread and the last rays of sunset streaming through the windows. For the first time in years, Clarissa felt the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen, replaced by something that felt surprisingly like hope. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm at Grace Haven Ranch. Each morning, Clarissa woke to bird song and the soft golden light filtering through her cabin window. She'd wrap herself in the floral quilt, taking a moment to whisper her morning prayers before starting her day. The peaceful routine began to heal something deep inside her. At 6:30 each morning, she joined the other residents for devotions in the main hall. Eli would read from Scripture, his voice steady and sure, while morning light streamed through the windows. Clarissa found herself looking forward to these quiet moments where nobody stared or whispered. They just listened together. "God doesn't see us the way others do," Eli reminded them one morning, his scarred hands holding his worn Bible. "He sees the heart." After prayers came breakfast and chores. Clarissa discovered she had a knack for organizing the pantry and helping Miss Thelma plan meals for the growing community. Her cornbread became a staple at dinner, and even some of Mason's friends began offering grudging compliments. "This ain't half bad," one of them admitted on the 6th evening, reaching for seconds. Mason himself kept his distance, though Clarissa sometimes caught him watching her with an unreadable expression. She tried not to let it bother her, focusing instead on the small victories each day brought. Like when little Tommy, a resident's son, asked her to read him a bedtime story, or when Miss Thelma declared her chicken and dumplings better than my own mama's. But peace, Clarissa was learning, could be as fragile as morning mist. It happened on the 8th day. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the main house, humming softly to herself, when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A sleek news van pulled up, its satellite dish gleaming in the morning sun. Her heart stuttered. "Miss Jones?" A man in a pressed shirt approached, holding a microphone. "Dennis Hargrove from Channel 5 News. Care to comment on your unusual situation?" Clarissa's hands froze on the damp sheet she was hanging. "I'm sorry?" He thrust a newspaper toward her. The headline hit her like a physical blow. "Hell's Angel buys obese virgin at church auction." The world tilted sideways. There was her photo, taken at the church that horrible night, splashed across the front page. The article was filled with cruel speculation about her relationship with Eli, quotes from townspeople about her desperate situation, and mocking references to her weight and single status. "Who?" she whispered. But then she saw Mason skulking behind the barn, his face a mix of guilt and defiance. He'd done this. Thought it would be funny. A joke. More vehicles were arriving now. 2 more news vans, several cars with reporters. They swarmed across the peaceful grounds like ants at a picnic, cameras flashing, voices calling out questions that made her cheeks burn with shame. Is this a legitimate religious organization or a front for exploitation? Were you really auctioned off as property? What's the nature of your relationship with Eli Matthews? Clarissa fled to her cabin, slamming the door. Through her window, she could see residents gathering in confused clusters, whispering and pointing. Some looked angry, others concerned. A few were already packing their bags. Miss Thelma appeared at her door an hour later, her face grave. "Sugar, you might want to know. 3 of our biggest donors just pulled their funding. They're saying they can't be associated with what they're calling a scandal." "This is all my fault," Clarissa whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I didn't ask for this attention. I never wanted—" "Hush now," Miss Thelma said firmly, but Clarissa could see the worry in her eyes. Throughout the day, the situation only worsened. More reporters arrived. Someone flew a drone over the property. The phone rang constantly with angry calls from church members and community leaders demanding explanations. Eli handled each one with quiet dignity, but Clarissa could see the strain in his face. By evening, 4 more residents had left, unable to handle the scrutiny. The peaceful sanctuary of Grace Haven was crumbling, and Clarissa knew exactly why. She waited until after dinner, when the reporters finally began to leave, then slipped back to her cabin and pulled out her suitcase. Her hands shook as she folded her few belongings. Tears splashed onto her clothes as she packed, but she forced herself to continue. She had to leave, had to stop hurting these people who'd shown her nothing but kindness. She was so focused on her task that she didn't hear the footsteps outside. When she turned toward the door, Eli was there, his broad frame filling the doorway. His eyes took in the half-packed suitcase, her tear-stained face. "Going somewhere?" he asked quietly. "I have to," she choked out. "Look what I've done to this place, to your work, to everyone's peace." "You haven't done anything," he said, taking a step into the room. "This is what the world does when it sees something it doesn't understand, something that threatens its comfortable judgments. But the donors, the residents leaving, it's all because of me." Eli moved to block the door, not threatening but firm. "You're not the problem, Clarissa," he said, his voice gentle but strong. "The world is. Stay, and let's show them what grace really looks like." Clarissa stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of her suitcase. The shame pulled at her, whispering that she should run, hide, disappear. But there was something in Eli's steady gaze that spoke of another possibility. A chance to stand firm, to face the storm with dignity instead of defeat. The suitcase lay between them, half closed, as Clarissa wrestled with the choice before her. Should she flee from the cruel spotlight, or stay and face whatever came next? The gentle evening breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of pine and possibility, as she stood suspended between shame and hope. Clarissa lowered her suitcase with trembling hands. "I'll stay," she whispered, barely loud enough for Eli to hear. His shoulders relaxed slightly, though concern still etched his weathered face. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He wasn't wrong. The next morning, more reporters crowded the entrance to Grace Haven Ranch, their cameras and microphones thrust forward like weapons. Clarissa watched from her cabin window as Eli strode out to meet them, his posture straight and determined. "As of this moment, Grace Haven Ranch is closed to all media," he announced, his voice carrying across the grounds. "Anyone attempting to interview our residents or take photographs will be considered trespassing. This is a place of healing, not a circus show." Some reporters argued, but Eli's military bearing and unwavering stance made it clear he meant business. He posted no trespassing signs along the fence line and instructed all residents to ignore any attempts at contact. Clarissa felt both grateful and guilty watching him defend the sanctuary he'd built. To keep her mind off the chaos, she threw herself into work. In the kitchen, she found peace in the familiar rhythms of cooking. The scent of fresh biscuits and hearty stew filled the air as she prepared meals for the remaining residents. Before each meal, she began leading short, simple prayers. Her voice, though soft, carried genuine warmth. "Lord, bless this food and the hands that prepared it. Help us find strength in each other and peace in your grace. Amen." Some residents who'd initially kept their distance began lingering after meals, drawn by her gentle presence and the comfort of her cooking. Miss Thelma taught her to tend the vegetable garden, showing her how to plant tomatoes and string beans. "You've got good hands for growing things," Miss Thelma observed, watching Clarissa carefully pat soil around a young pepper plant. Gentle but strong. 4 days into the media storm, Clarissa was weeding between rows of carrots when she heard strange sounds coming from behind the barn. Following the noise, she found Mason slumped against the weathered wood, an almost empty bottle of whiskey beside him. His eyes were red from crying, his usual sharp edges softened by alcohol and guilt. When he saw her, he tried to scramble up but stumbled, falling back against the barn wall. "I'm sorry," he slurred, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so damn sorry, Clarissa. I thought it would be funny. Thought I'd get back at this place, at Eli, for trying to fix me. I didn't know they'd—" Clarissa knelt beside him, her knees sinking into the soft earth. Without hesitation, she took his trembling hands in hers. "I forgive you, Mason." He stared at her, confusion breaking through his drunken haze. "How can you? I ruined everything. The donors leaving, people going home, all because I thought it would be funny to call that reporter." "Hate doesn't heal," she said softly, squeezing his hands. "Only mercy does. I've had enough of hate in my life to know it never makes anything better." Mason broke down completely then, sobbing like a lost child. Clarissa stayed with him, her presence steady and forgiving, until his tears subsided. Word of her forgiveness spread through the ranch like a healing balm. Residents who'd been avoiding each other, caught up in taking sides, began to reconnect. The tension that had filled the air started to dissolve. That evening, As the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Miss Thelma brought out her old guitar. She started strumming Amazing Grace, and slowly, others gathered around the community fire pit. Clarissa sat between Eli and Mason, their shadows dancing in the firelight. Her voice joined the others, tremulous at first but growing stronger. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. The harmony wasn't perfect, but it was real and raw and healing. Mason's voice cracked on certain words, but he kept singing. Miss Thelma's fingers stumbled occasionally on the strings, but the music flowed on. Eli's deep voice provided a steady foundation, and Clarissa felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since the auction, since the headlines, since all the shame and pain, she felt truly at peace. The flames crackled and sparked, carrying their voices up into the darkening sky. More residents emerged from their cabins, drawn by the music and the warmth of community. Even those who didn't know the words hummed along, swaying gently to the rhythm. As the last notes faded into the night air, Clarissa looked around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight. She saw strength there, and hurt, and hope, all mixed together like the ingredients of a well-loved recipe. The ranch felt whole again, if only for this precious moment. The stars began appearing overhead, one by one, as if they too were gathering to witness this small miracle of healing. The night air carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called out its lonely song. But here, in this circle of light and music, there was no loneliness. There was only the quiet triumph of grace over judgment, of mercy over shame, of community over division. The headlines and cameras seemed far away now, unable to touch this sacred space they'd created together. A month passed, and Grace Haven Ranch bloomed like a garden after rain. The media circus had moved on to fresher scandals, leaving behind a stronger, closer-knit community. At the center of this transformation was Clarissa Jones. Her presence filled the ranch with unexpected joy. The kitchen, once a place of hurried meals and minimal conversation, now buzzed with warmth and laughter. The old stove seemed to work better under her care, producing heavenly aromas that drew people in throughout the day. "Miss Clarissa," 8-year-old Sarah called out one morning, tugging at her apron. "Can you teach me to make those cookies again? The ones with the cinnamon?" Clarissa's face lit up. "Of course, sugar. Go wash those hands and we'll get started." Soon, Sarah and 3 other children were gathered around the kitchen island, their small faces dusted with flour as Clarissa guided their hands in measuring ingredients. Her patience never wavered, even when little Tommy spilled milk across the counter. "That's all right, baby," she soothed, already reaching for a cloth. "Accidents help us learn to be careful." The veterans, too, found comfort in her presence. James, who rarely spoke about his time in Afghanistan, would sit at the kitchen table late at night, nursing a cup of tea while Clarissa kneaded bread for the next day. Sometimes he'd share fragments of his memories, and she'd listen without judgment, her hands steady in their work. "You remind me of my mama," he told her one evening. She could listen like that too. Eli noticed the change in everyone. The tension that had once haunted the ranch's corridors had mellowed into something peaceful. Even Mason, who'd struggled with anger management, seemed calmer after his morning conversations with Clarissa over coffee. One crisp morning, as dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and purples, Eli found Clarissa already awake, standing by the lake. He'd been taking these early walks alone for years, finding solace in the quiet moments before the day began. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice gentle in the morning stillness. She smiled, nodding, and they fell into step together. Their footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path that circled the lake. Neither felt the need to fill the silence immediately. Finally, Eli spoke. "You've brought something special to this place, Clarissa. These people, they're healing differently now." She ducked her head, embarrassed by the praise. "I'm just trying to be useful." "It's more than that. You see people's hurt and meet it with grace." Their morning walks became a ritual. Each day they'd meet as the sun rose, sharing thoughts about faith, loss, and the journey toward healing. Eli spoke about the fire that claimed his rescue team, the guilt that still woke him in the night. Clarissa listened with the same gentle attention she gave everyone else. One morning, as they watched a family of ducks glide across the lake's surface, Clarissa shared her own story of loss. "I was engaged once," she said quietly, her hands clasped together. "Right after Mama got sick. Thomas was his name. He said he loved me, even with my size. Said it didn't matter." Eli waited, knowing there was more. "But after Mama passed," her voice caught. "The grief hit hard. I couldn't stop crying, couldn't get out of bed some days. Thomas said I was too big, too sad. Said he needed someone who could make him happy." She wiped a tear away. "He left a note. Didn't even say goodbye in person." Eli's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained gentle. "His weakness isn't your shame, Clarissa." Later that afternoon, Pastor Lowell Carter's car pulled into the ranch's driveway. Eli met him on the porch, noting the worry lines creasing the older man's forehead. "We need to talk, Eli," the pastor said, his voice low. "It's about the donors." They walked to Eli's office, a small room filled with books and grant applications. The pastor settled into a chair with a heavy sigh. "They're threatening to pull their support," he said without preamble. "The controversy around Clarissa, it's making them nervous. They're worried about their reputations, their businesses." Eli leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. And they're saying they'll cut funding if she stays." Pastor Lowell spread his hands helplessly. "I know it's not right, but without their support, then they can take their money." The pastor blinked. "Eli, be reasonable. This place, these people, they need the funding." "What they need," Eli said quietly, "is to see that grace isn't just a word we throw around on Sundays. It's standing right there in our kitchen, teaching kids to bake cookies and veterans to trust again." That evening, as residents gathered for the nightly bonfire, Eli watched Clarissa across the flames. She sat with Sarah in her lap, teaching the little girl a clapping game. Her laughter carried over, the crackling fire mingling with the evening breeze. The firelight softened her features, highlighting the gentle curve of her smile, the warmth in her eyes. Something shifted in Eli's chest as he watched her. A recognition, a awakening. His heart, so long focused only on survival and service, had begun to change. He remembered her words from their morning walk. Too big, too sad. Looking at her now, all he saw was grace made visible, love in action. The flames danced between them as night settled over Grace Haven Ranch, and Eli Matthews realized he was seeing Clarissa Jones with new eyes. The July heat had been building for days, pressing down on Grace Haven Ranch like a heavy blanket. Clarissa noticed the change first, the way the birds went quiet, how the air grew thick and still. She stood on the porch of the main house, watching dark clouds gather on the horizon. "Something's coming," she murmured to herself, her hand pressed against her heart. The first drops fell just as the residents finished their evening meal. Within minutes, the sky opened up with fury. Lightning split the darkness, followed by thunder that shook the windows. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a wild thing. "Everyone stay calm!" Eli's voice carried over the storm's roar. He was already moving, directing people away from windows. Those in the lower cabins, grab what you can and move to the main house. Clarissa watched in horror as the wind tore at the fence posts, ripping them from the ground like twigs. The vegetable garden they'd worked so hard on disappeared under rising water as the creek overflowed its banks. A scream cut through the chaos. "The children!" someone shouted from outside. "They're still in the craft cabin." Without thinking, Clarissa pushed through the door into the storm. Rain stung her face as she fought against the wind, her feet slipping in the mud. The craft cabin sat at the bottom of a small hill, and water was already seeping under its door. Inside, she found 3 children huddled together, Sarah, Tommy, and little Marcus. They clung to each other, eyes wide with fear. "Come on, babies," Clarissa said, forcing calm into her voice despite her racing heart. "We're going to play a game. Everyone hold hands, like a train." She led them through the downpour, singing "This Little Light of Mine" to drown out the thunder. Her chest burned with the effort, but she kept moving, kept singing. When they finally reached the main house, Miss Thelma wrapped the children in warm blankets, while Clarissa caught her breath. But there was no time to rest. Through the rain-streaked windows, she saw Eli running toward the old storage shed. Mason's grandfather, Mr. Peterson, used it as his workshop, and the old veteran was still inside. "The roof's coming down!" someone yelled. Eli disappeared into the shed, just as another lightning bolt illuminated the sky. Seconds stretched like hours until finally he emerged with Mr. Peterson, leaning heavily against him. As they struggled towards the house, a loud crack split the air. A branch from the old oak tree swung down, catching Eli across his right shoulder. He stumbled but didn't drop Mr. Peterson. Clarissa and Mason ran out to help, supporting both men into the safety of the main house. "My shoulder," Eli grimaced as Clarissa helped him sit. "Think it might be dislocated." The storm raged through the night. They all huddled together in the main house, 37 souls seeking shelter from nature's fury. Clarissa moved among them, offering comfort, sharing blankets, and leading quiet prayers when the thunder grew too frightening. Dawn brought an eerie silence. The rain had stopped, but the damage was stark in the morning light. Half the fence lay scattered across the property. The lower cabin stood in 6 inches of water. The garden was gone, along with most of the chicken coop. Even the main house hadn't escaped. Part of the roof had caved in over the kitchen. Eli sat at his desk, his arm in a makeshift sling, staring at papers spread before him. The insurance company's response had come through email. "Claim denied due to unregistered property zones and inadequate documentation of structures." Clarissa found him there, his face drawn with pain and worry. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling into a bucket beside his desk. "We're finished," he said softly, his voice hollow. "No insurance, no savings left. Can't house people in flooded cabins or feed them without a garden." He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw defeat in his eyes. "I failed them. Failed you." Clarissa knelt beside his chair, taking his good hand in both of hers. His skin was rough, marked with old scars from his firefighting days. These were hands that had saved lives, built hope, offered second chances. "Not if I can help it," she said quietly. She reached into her ever-present purse and pulled out a worn envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, the corners soft from years of handling. Written across the front in shaky handwriting were the words, "Grandma's Trust Fund." "My grandmother cleaned houses her whole life," Clarissa said, her voice thick with emotion. "Saved every extra penny she could. When she passed, she left it to me. Said I should wait for something that really mattered." She pressed the envelope into his hand. "This place matters, Eli. These people matter." Rain began falling again, gentler now, pattering against the broken roof. But inside that office, Something stronger than a storm was building. Hope, taking root like a stubborn flower pushing through concrete. Clarissa's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside lay a bank statement and her grandmother's last letter, written in careful cursive on pale blue paper. My grandmother, Ruby Mae Johnson, worked as a housekeeper for 42 years, Clarissa explained, her voice soft with memory. She cleaned other people's homes 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Every month, she'd put aside a little something, even if it was just $5. She smoothed the letter with gentle fingers. When I was young, I'd ask her why she worked so hard. She always said, "Baby girl, I'm storing up treasures in heaven." Eli sat quietly, his injured shoulder forgotten, as he watched tears gather in Clarissa's eyes. When she passed, I found out she'd saved nearly $50,000, Clarissa continued. Left it all to me. But I couldn't touch it. Didn't feel right. Spending money that came from her sweat and sacrifice. Felt like I hadn't earned it. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. That money saved me once, when Mama got sick and the medical bills piled up. Now it can save others. Clarissa, no. Eli's voice was firm but gentle. You've already given more than enough to this place. Your time, your heart. My heart, Clarissa interrupted, a sudden fire in her eyes. My heart was dead before I came here, Eli Matthews. I was just going through the motions, existing but not living. This place... She gestured around them, at the water-damaged walls and broken ceiling. This place gave me back my life. Let me give this to God's work. Rain continued to fall outside, but inside the office, something shifted. Eli looked at Clarissa for a long moment, seeing not the woman others had mocked, but someone filled with quiet strength and boundless grace. All right, he said finally, but we do this together. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Word spread through the community about Grace Haven's plight, and volunteers began showing up. First came the residents' families, then church groups, and finally strangers who'd heard about the ranch's mission. Clarissa organized everything from her grandmother's old recipe book, where she kept her notes and plans. She coordinated work crews, arranged meal schedules, and made sure every volunteer felt appreciated. Her cornbread became famous among the workers, who gathered eagerly at lunch breaks to share food and stories. Mason worked tirelessly beside her, as if trying to make up for his earlier mistakes. He taught younger volunteers how to repair fences and replace rotted boards, his military training showing in his precise instructions. "Miss Clarissa," he said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow, "I never properly apologized for what I did, with the reporter and all." Clarissa handed him a glass of sweet tea. "That's all past now, sugar. Sometimes God uses our mistakes to build something beautiful." The garden came back to life under Miss Thelma's guidance. She showed Clarissa how to save waterlogged plants and when to replant others. Together they created a new layout, adding raised beds to prevent future flooding. Every evening, as the sun set, Clarissa led whoever was willing in hymns. Her voice, clear and strong, carried across the property as hammers fell silent and saw blades stilled. Even those who didn't know the words would stop to listen as she sang "Amazing Grace" or "How Great Thou Art." Eli worked alongside everyone, despite his injured shoulder, which was healing slowly. He watched Clarissa with growing amazement as she transformed from a quiet presence into the heart of their community. She seemed to know exactly what each person needed: a kind word, a moment of prayer, or sometimes just a slice of warm cornbread and a listening ear. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Eli found Clarissa sitting on the newly rebuilt front porch. She was writing in her grandmother's recipe book, adding names of volunteers and little notes about the day's progress. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said, settling carefully into the chair beside her. You've turned her life savings into something miraculous." Clarissa closed the book gently. "She always said money was just a tool. It's what you build with it that matters." "You've built more than just buildings here," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've rebuilt hope. Lives." He turned to face her fully. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Clarissa Jones." She looked up at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. In the fading light, his scars seemed to fade, and she saw only the tenderness in his eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand. Eli drew her into an embrace, careful of his healing shoulder. It was a quiet moment, almost sacred. Two broken people who had found wholeness in helping others heal. Neither of them noticed the flash of a camera in the growing darkness, or the figure of Dennis Hargrove, the reporter, slipping away through the shadows. He clutched his camera, knowing he had captured something powerful, but for the first time in his career, he felt uncertain about how to use it. The day's last light caught the dewdrops on the new garden fence, making them sparkle like tiny stars. Inside the main house, voices rose in evening prayer, while outside, fireflies began their nightly dance over the restored fields of Grace Haven Ranch. The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when Dennis Hargrove's article hit the internet. Headlines screamed across social media, "Hell's Angel in love with the woman he bought." The story spread like wildfire, complete with the intimate photo of Eli and Clarissa's embrace on the porch. Clarissa's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Each new comment felt like a knife to her heart. People she'd never met dissected her appearance, mocked her weight, and questioned her worth. Some called their relationship disgusting, while others suggested Eli must be mentally ill to care for someone like her. "Look at the size of her," one comment read. "He must have a fetish." "Wonder how much he paid for that whale," said another. "This is what's wrong with Christianity today," a third declared. Miss Thelma found Clarissa in the kitchen, tears falling silently into her morning coffee. "Don't you read that garbage, honey," she said, taking the phone away. "Those people don't know your heart." But the damage was spreading beyond cruel comments. By mid-morning, Grace Haven's office phone rang constantly. Previous donors called to withdraw their support, citing moral concerns and inappropriate relationships. The bank called next, informing them that someone had reported suspicious activity, freezing their accounts pending investigation. Mason burst through the door, his face pale. "There are protesters at the gate," he reported. "News vans, too. It's getting ugly out there." Eli stood at the window, watching as people gathered at the entrance with crude signs. Their shouts carried across the peaceful morning air. "Shame on Grace Haven! Stop exploiting vulnerable women! Hell's Angel is the devil!" "This is insanity," Eli muttered, his scarred hands clenched. "They're turning our story into something dirty." Clarissa watched from behind the curtain as more vehicles arrived. She recognized some faces from her old church, people who'd laughed at her that night at the auction. Now they stood with self-righteous anger, condemning the very place that had saved her. Throughout the morning, the situation deteriorated. Residents huddled in their cabins, afraid to step outside. The children couldn't play in the yard because protesters kept taking photos. Miss Thelma tried calling the police, but they said as long as the protesters stayed off private property, they couldn't intervene. Around noon, a rock sailed through the dining hall window, shattering glass across tables set for lunch. Eli rushed to board up the window, his injured shoulder making him wince with every movement. When he finished, he found Clarissa in the pantry, methodically organizing cans as if trying to create order in a world spinning out of control. "This will pass," he said softly, touching her shoulder. "We've weathered storms before." But Clarissa saw the truth in his eyes. This wasn't just a storm. It was a tsunami threatening to destroy everything he'd built. The ranch's reputation, its ability to help others, all of it crumbling because of her presence. She waited until everyone was asleep that night. In her small cabin, she pulled out her mother's old stationery and began to write. "Dear Eli, your kindness saved my life that night at the auction. You showed me what true grace looks like. But I won't let your goodness be punished for me. Grace Haven matters too much to too many people. Sometimes love means knowing when to walk away." She folded the letter carefully and placed it on her perfectly made bed. In the dark hours before dawn, she slipped out the back gate where she knew Mason was on guard duty. He saw her but didn't stop her, understanding in his eyes. The early morning bus was nearly empty. Clarissa sat alone, her small bag in her lap, watching Grace Haven disappear through tears. She was heading to her hometown, to her mother's old church. The same church that had rejected her, but the only place she had left to go. Back at the ranch, the sun rose over another day of chaos. Eli knocked on Clarissa's cabin door, bringing coffee as he did every morning. When she didn't answer, he pushed the door open. The sight of the letter on the bed stopped him cold. His hands shook as he read her words. Without hesitation, he grabbed his truck keys and ran for the parking lot. Miss Thelma caught him at his truck. "She took the early bus," Mason called from the gate. "Headed south." Eli gunned the engine, tires throwing gravel as he sped toward the highway. The morning sun blinded him as he drove east, but he didn't slow down. Somewhere ahead was the woman who had brought light back to Grace Haven and to his heart. He wouldn't let her disappear into darkness again. In his rearview mirror, protesters waved their signs at his departing truck. But for the first time since he'd started Grace Haven, Eli wasn't thinking about the ranch or its mission. His only thought was of Clarissa and the empty space she'd left behind. The old truck roared down the highway as dawn painted the sky in shades of hope and heartbreak. Eli's injured shoulder throbbed with every mile, but he pressed on. He had already lost too much in his life to fire and fear. He wouldn't lose Clarissa to cruelty and shame. On the bus ahead, Clarissa watched the familiar landscape roll past, each mile taking her further from the only place she'd felt truly accepted. She clutched her mother's Bible to her chest, praying for strength, for understanding, for peace. But mostly, she prayed for Eli and Grace Haven, that her sacrifice would somehow restore what the headlines had destroyed. The rain started as a gentle mist, then grew steadily heavier as Eli's old pickup truck rumbled through the empty streets of the small town. His windshield wipers squeaked back and forth, fighting against the downpour as he searched for the familiar white steeple of Clarissa's church. His shoulder ached with every turn of the wheel, but he barely noticed. His mind was filled with worry for Clarissa, imagining her alone and hurting. The streets were eerily quiet in the early morning rain, shops still dark and sidewalks deserted. Finally, through the gray curtain of rain, he spotted it, the tall white steeple rising above the trees. As he pulled up to the church, his headlights cut through the gloom and illuminated a figure kneeling on the wet steps. Clarissa was there, exactly where something in his heart told him she would be. She was soaked through, her clothes clinging to her, but she remained still in prayer, her face lifted to the sky as rain streamed down her cheeks. Eli's throat tightened at the sight. He parked quickly and got out, not bothering with an umbrella. The cold rain immediately drenched him as he approached the steps. "Clarissa," he called softly. She turned, her eyes wide with surprise and something else. Shame, perhaps, or fear. "Eli," she whispered. "You shouldn't have come. I'm so sorry. Sorry for everything." All I've done is bring trouble into your life. The ranch, your reputation, everything you've worked for." Eli didn't hesitate. He walked up the steps and knelt beside her on the wet concrete, ignoring the pain in his injured shoulder. Rain ran down his face as he looked into her eyes. "You didn't ruin my life, Clarissa," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You gave it back to me." A small sob escaped her as she shook her head, but before she could protest, movement caught their attention. People were gathering, some locals heading to early morning services, others clearly reporters who had followed Eli's truck. A few familiar faces from Grace Haven were there too, including Miss Thelma and Mason, who must have followed in their own vehicles. The crowd grew larger, murmuring and pointing phones at them, but instead of shrinking away, Eli stood up. He faced them all, rain dripping from his leather jacket, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "You want a story?" he called out to the reporters. "Here's your headline. This woman you mocked, the one you called useless, she's the reason I believe in God again." The crowd fell silent, phones still recording as Eli continued, his voice growing stronger. "I lost my faith years ago, after watching good people die in a fire I couldn't stop. I built Grace Haven thinking I could save others, but I was just running from my own pain. Then Clarissa came, and I saw what real faith looks like, not in sermons or judgments, but in simple acts of love." Rain poured down harder, but no one moved. Eli's words seemed to hold them all in place. She forgave the people who hurt her. She gave everything she had to help strangers. Her love and courage healed more wounds than any sermon ever could. And you, he looked directly at some of the locals who had been at the auction. You called her useless. You made her pain into entertainment. Several people in the crowd lowered their heads. Others wiped at their eyes, and it wasn't just rain on their faces now. Even some of the reporters had stopped filming, caught up in the raw emotion of the moment. Behind Eli, Clarissa buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by his words and the grace they carried. Camera flashes sparked through the rain like lightning, capturing the moment. Not of shame this time, but of redemption. The rain continued to fall, but something had shifted in the air. The silence that followed Eli's words wasn't the cruel silence of judgment anymore. It was the quiet of hearts being changed, of truth breaking through walls of prejudice and pride. Clarissa remained on her knees, her prayers now mixed with tears of gratitude and disbelief. The love she had always longed for, always believed she didn't deserve, was being declared publicly, unashamedly, in front of the very people who had once mocked her. The water running down the church, steps carried away old pain, old shame, washing clean the place where her heart had been broken. And there stood Eli, her unlikely angel, testifying to the power of the very thing she had almost stopped believing in, grace. The video of Eli's passionate speech in the rain spread across social media like wildfire. Within hours, millions had watched the raw footage of the scarred ex-firefighter defending Clarissa on those rain-soaked church steps. But this time, instead of cruel comments and mockery, something beautiful happened. "This is what real love looks like," one viral comment read, gathering thousands of likes. Messages of support flooded in from around the country. People shared their own stories of judgment and redemption in the comments. Local news stations picked up the story, then national ones. But unlike the earlier sensational headlines, these focused on Grace Haven's mission and the transformative power of unconditional acceptance. Within days, donations began pouring in, small amounts from ordinary people touched by their story. $5, $20, whatever they could spare. Larger checks arrived from charitable foundations. Grace Haven's frozen accounts were unfrozen, and soon the ranch had more resources than ever before. Eli used the funds wisely, expanding the facilities to help more people. Other communities reached out, wanting to replicate the Grace Haven model. Within months, similar ranches began opening across the country, each one built on the same foundation of faith, service, and unconditional love. Clarissa found herself invited to speak on Christian television shows. She appeared nervous at first, smoothing her dress with trembling hands, but her genuine spirit shone through. She spoke not of herself, but of God's grace and the power of forgiveness. "Pain can either break us or break us open," she would say softly. "Being broken open means letting the light in." Yet fame didn't change her heart. She still spent most mornings in Grace Haven's kitchen, singing hymns while baking bread. She knew every resident's favorite foods, their stories, their struggles. On Sundays, her voice still lifted above the others during worship, carrying the same joy it always had. In quiet moments, she and Eli would walk by the lake where their friendship first deepened. They shared simple conversations and comfortable silences, their hearts at peace. Sometimes they would sit on the dock, watching the sunset paint the water gold, and marvel at how God had turned their pain into purpose. "Who would have thought," Eli would say with a gentle smile, "that what started with an auction would end up changing so many lives?" And Clarissa would squeeze his hand, grateful for the journey that had brought them here, to this place of grace and healing. The late September air carried the sweet scent of magnolias and fresh rain as people gathered under the massive oak tree at Grace Haven. The same tree that had withstood the devastating storm now spread its branches like a natural cathedral over the wedding preparations below. Wooden chairs lined the grass in neat rows, filled with a mix of ranch residents, local townspeople, and even some faces that Clarissa recognized from that painful night at the church auction. They looked different now, humbled, genuine, their eyes soft with understanding instead of judgment. White ribbons danced in the breeze, wrapped around mason jars filled with wildflowers. Lily Ann Parker, the shy 10-year-old girl who had become Clarissa's shadow, scattered rose petals down the makeshift aisle, her usual stutter forgotten in the joy of the moment. When Clarissa appeared in her simple white dress, a collective breath of appreciation rose from the gathering. She walked slowly, proudly, her head held high, no longer the woman who once tried to hide in corners. Miss Thelma, seated in the front row, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Eli stood waiting beneath the oak's sprawling canopy, his scarred hands clasped together, wearing a dark suit that couldn't hide his rugged strength. His eyes never left Clarissa as she approached, filled with a warmth that made the autumn air feel warmer. During the exchange of vows, Eli's deep voice carried across the gathered crowd. "They saw a useless woman," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw heaven's miracle." The words hung in the air like a testimony, making several former gossips bow their heads in shame. Clarissa's response came as a whisper, but it carried clearly in the hushed silence. "And I saw the angel God sent to find me." Their hands joined together as tears of joy traced down her cheeks. Weeks after the ceremony, the chapel at Grace Haven rang with music. Clarissa sat at the old piano, patiently teaching Lily Ann to sing. The young girl's voice, once trapped by fear and shame, rose clear and strong through the stained glass windows, filling the space with hope. Outside, the new sign swayed gently in the breeze. Grace Haven, where every soul has worth. The sound of their singing merged with the rustling leaves and distant laughter from the ranch, a symphony of redemption that echoed across the grounds. The harmonies of their voices blended with the wind through the trees, creating a melody of healing that seemed to touch every corner of the property. It was more than just music. It was the sound of broken spirits finding their worth, of judgment transformed into joy, of grace made real in the most unexpected ways. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.